everyone, and welcome to European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. We have our interview guest today, his very special guest. It's Paul Massaro. Welcome in Berlin, Paul.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thank you, Sergey.
And Paul is Senior Policy Advisor at US Helsinki Commission, which is Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And Paul is in Berlin now, and he's very deep in Ukrainian issues. And my first question to you, Paul, where are jets?
Where are jets? Where are the F-16s? Yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, we need them bad. Clearly, the Ukrainians understand that they're needed badly, and they're probably saw the recent campaign on, Sky needs F-16s. I think that what the administration would tell you is that they're focused on, I guess, what they would see as the higher priorities of ensuring that the deliveries that have been promised in the form of infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, and I mean, all the other equipment that's badly needed in Ukraine, right? I mean, when we think about like the heavy weapons, of course, those are critical, but then also there's, mortars and small arms and all that kind of thing. Medical supply is also badly needed. And that's what the administration would tell you. I think there's another reason behind this, of course. I don't, I mean, to me, if we're going to really help the Ukrainians and get them everything they need to win, obviously one would think we would have had the jets there by now, because this has been an ask for quite some time. Even at the get-go, I don't know if you recall when High Representative Borrell, like right out the gate, was like, "We're going to send jets," and then there was remember the whole original MiGs catastrophe where suddenly it was like, "Oh no, we're not. Oh yes, we are," and then it was like, "Oh no, it'd be too escalatory." And I think that issue with escalation still haunts everyone, right? I think that the big reasons why ATACMS and F-16s haven't been sent is still this kind of the remainder. I think a lot of this notion has been dealt with, but it still remains that to send these kinds of weapons would lead Russia to escalate, whatever this means. I mean, I think that what it means to a lot of people is the use of a nuclear weapon. I mean, that's what it must mean, because one is hard pressed to imagine what more Russia could do to escalate. I mean, they're already using terrorist attacks like crazy against. I mean, just recently, another Ukrainian apartment building killing 22 people, including children, for no reason other than to terrorize these people. So one would, again, be hard-pressed to imagine what escalation must mean, if not the use of nuclear weapons.
Well, we will definitely go back to the topic of nuclear weapons and nuclear terrorism in this interview, but let me stay on the topic of the weapons. When we say Ukraine needs that and that for Ukrainian victory, and one of your recent tweets was Ukraine must win this war. Mm-hmm. I heard like a lot of people in Ukraine saying they don't want us to win, they want us to fight as long as possible. How substantial are these fears of Ukrainians?
So when I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, I heard a lot of the same. I mean, I heard a lot of, "Do you really want us to win?" It was always, the Ukrainians are very charitable and humble about it. I mean, they're not ungrateful. They always preface things with, "We understand, your weapons have made it possible for us to defend ourselves." And I always you don't need to be grateful. You're fighting for everybody. You're fighting for the whole free world, but they're always very grateful. They're always very humble about it. But they always follow it up with, "Okay, but you've given us enough so that we can defend ourselves. We can't really win the war." So you're exactly right. I do not believe the calculation is, we don't want the Ukrainians to win. I mean, that's kind of, I think that's maybe a really...
But that is the impression which Ukrainians get, and that is very bad that they get this impression.
That it is very bad. It is horrific. And this is what I always report back to the bosses, what I always tell everyone around DC is, this is really bad. I mean, to tell the State Department, tell everybody we can, is you don't understand. I mean, this kind of impression makes it look like the United States is betraying its promises, makes us look like we're ridiculous in the sense of like, okay, it even makes us look like we're ridiculous to constituents, right? Because if you go back to your constituents and you say, well, we're giving them enough weapons so that they can hit a stalemate and there can be some negotiated peace, which is really a Russian victory, and Russia will then start the war again in 5 years. We're going to have to arm up Europe. It's going to cost us way more money than it would otherwise cost us just to win outright, and all this other kind of stuff. The constituents are like, what? Just give them the weapons they need to win and have it done. So I don't think this comes from, this is the intellectual exercise of trying to like understand your audiences, right? I don't think this comes from a place of, oh yeah, no, we really want the Ukrainians to just fight it out and we want max casualties. That's crap. That's Russian disinformation. I can understand why the Ukrainians seeing what we're doing might come to that conclusion, because they might be like, well, what else makes sense? And I'm sad to say the real reasons I think are much more, in a sense, much less understandable and much more academic and intellectual, in the sense of like, well, Berlin, Paris, and Washington kind of get together and they're kind of like, yikes, to send this or that or the other thing would lead to Russia doing this or that or the other thing. And we've got to game this out and we've got to do X, Y, and Z. And we've got to make sure that Russia doesn't do this and blah, blah, blah. It's extremely foolish in kind of this sense that only the bureaucracy can be foolish, it's arguing with yourself and negotiating with yourself, when exactly the opposite has been proven. We have sent everything that was supposed to cause escalation, and it didn't cause escalation. We sanctioned, didn't cause escalation. We sent javelins, didn't cause escalation. We sent HIMARS, didn't cause escalation. Tanks didn't cause escalation. IFVs didn't cause escalation. The list goes on. It's time to throw this argument out and just send Ukraine what it needs.
Well, to make this story with the Jets, like to bring it to the end, and you have mentioned tanks. The US has promised tanks, hasn't sent tanks yet, but we all hope that the Abrams will arrive soon. But what the US did, the US really pressured for good Germany and Europe to send Leopards to Ukraine, which are already on the field. Can it be now the opposite step from Europe? When Europe sends, let me say, Tornadoes to Ukraine, would it pressure the US to send F-16s?
Maybe. I'd hope. I'd hope we'd all just get together and get the jets there. That said, I think we can do multi-speed. If Europe wants to send tornadoes, Europe should send tornadoes. It shouldn't, like, don't wait up for the United States. It actually made more sense in the Leopards debate as well, just to send the Leopards. Even the whole thing, like, yeah, we should send F-16s and Abrams. We should, but we also. It also shouldn't be incumbent upon the United States to have to send these things in order for Europe to send its stuff. The Leopards were obviously an easier delivery. They were more convenient. They were there. The logistical chains are there. It's much simpler to load up Ukraine with Leopards than Abrams. Now, does that mean the United States shouldn't send Abrams? No, the United States should send Abrams. The Ukrainians should have everything. So I guess I just want to say that, Slovakia and Poland have already sent MiGs, and that's great, but obviously MiGs don't get the job done against Sus. We need to get F-16s there. But just because one country is holding itself back doesn't mean that others shouldn't just go ahead and do things. And in fact, I think that, I guess to answer your question, if you did send tornadoes, I think the United States would feel more pressure to send F-16s, in the sense of if people start going, then others feel safer to follow.
That is what I could observe in Germany for months, when Germany always tried to hide behind other countries. They say, if Poland does that, we do that. If Britain does that, we do that. Is it the question of leadership in the Western world, when everyone tries to hide behind the backs? Okay, in the beginning, the US and the UK were the real leaders, but after that, they were demanding also from Germany, and Germany was not ready to deliver, so it somehow stuck.
Yeah, I think that it is that, particularly for Germany, but I think everybody's got their own psychoses in a sense. I think the German psychosis is this weird position of being both the main arms manufacturer for Europe somehow. How did that happen? Plus, kind of this notion of this deep fear of being out in front, this need for Zusammengänge, and this notion of we can't do anything on our own, and yet they've also held up weapons deliveries on their own. So in one sense, they can do stuff on their own. They can not send weapons on their own. They can prevent others from sending weapons. But of course, it feels like we're past maybe that phase when they were stopping the Estonians from sending East German howitzers and that kind of thing. But in any case, that's kind of, I think, the primary German issue. Whereas I feel like others have other problems, like with the French, there's always this kind of holdup of, well, I think if any one country is in the world of like, do we really want Ukraine to win? It's the French, because I think the French are kind of just traditionally the balance of power country, kind of like the having Russia there is a nice balance to America, and it kind of keeps the USA on its toes. And Macron goes to China, you know, just a few weeks ago, and says we need to distance ourselves from the United States in the middle of this, like the biggest war since World War II in Europe, where the United States is providing the majority of the security assistance. Now's the time for France again to say that Europe needs to distance itself from the United States. I mean, it's almost farcical in the way that kind of, you know, France has this perspective of I mean, almost path dependent perspective of like balancing powers. And then with the United States, I think there's still kind of the, you know, particularly with this administration, this deep hesitancy that's drawn from both one, the Iraq War, and then two, kind of the Trump years of kind of a caution about American power and whether America should be super involved, because it seems like we've gotten involved in these things and it hasn't gone well. And then Trump kind of went to Europe and wasn't very nice to Germans and all this kind of other stuff. So there's kind of more of a hesitancy and a feeling that democracy is very fragile, and how deeply should we get involved?
But this, what you're saying is makes me scared, because what you describe is that the US and the collective West is still fighting the past. Like you have mentioned Iraq War and Trump, and you haven't mentioned Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is clearly in the room.
Yeah, the Afghanistan withdrawal in particular.
Exactly, the withdrawal. And but now we are in quite another situation with the Russian war against the West, and we need to act accordingly. Is there understanding that Russia is the enemy which need to be defeated, not repelled from Ukraine, but defeated?
Well, we're getting there, and we're getting there much too slowly, but we're getting there. I mean, we are absolutely fighting the past. Everybody's fighting the past. I mean, you live in Germany, you know. if any single country spends every day fighting the past, it's Germany. But I mean, you know, obviously we're all dealing with our particular national psychoses and what's holding us back. And you know, that all said, we've all preached and professed and embraced, you know, a set of universal values, liberal values, and fundamental freedoms that we claim to be our kind of what we're fighting for, and the basis for our civilization. And those are the things that have to, at the end of the day, shine through, despite the issues that might hold us back. And I think that's what the Ukrainians are constantly screaming at us, kind of like, this is what you stand for, please. You know, this is what we're fighting for. We're literally fighting for you. You know, please realize this. Some of us have. Some of us have been much slower to realize. I think that there's some have been very slow to realize what an existential threat all of this poses for the West. I mean, this is Russia's chance to, or Russia's attempt to overthrow basically the entire post-Cold War consensus, right? To redraw the map, to rewrite everything. I mean, the goal of this, of course, was to take over Ukraine immediately, which everyone thought was in the cards, was going to happen, fall in 3 days, then take Moldova, which probably would have, you know, basically just given up without a fight, since it's so small, doesn't have the military power, although nobody thought Ukraine had the military power either. Then China invades Taiwan, and then Russia incurs into NATO. And it's at that point, when it was unclear that Ukraine would be able to defend itself, that Chancellor Scholz gave the Zeitenwende speech, and that everybody was taking it seriously, because there was kind of a feeling of, oh my God, like Russia's coming for all of us. But then when the Ukrainians actually turned out to be like the most resilient, amazing people on the planet that actually embraced our values more than we seem ever to have, maybe since World War II, we all kind of breathed a sigh of relief in a sense, like, okay, the Russians are stuck in Ukraine. They're not really able to come with us. We can kind of chill out and take our time on this. And then the Ukrainians are like, what? You know, like, now especially is the time when you should be backing us, when you should be ensuring that this can't happen again, when you should be doubling down and defending this order, because it's not going to stop. I mean, Russia's goals haven't changed. Nothing's fundamentally changed. And at the end of the day, if we don't back up Ukraine will ultimately lose. I mean, Ukraine's got the spirit, they've got the moxie, they've got everything, but again, they're limited on people. They don't have as many people. I mean, Russia will just continually throw people into this forever. So they need the weapons. They need the weapons that will enable them to level the playing field.
That's indeed so. Let me change the topic and to come to the nuclear threats of Russia. And Russia controls now Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the biggest one in Europe. And this power plant is effectively under control of Rosatom. And also the Russians say legally that it is under control of Rosatom. And they keep the personnel of the station as hostages. They threaten to let the disaster happen, etc. Why does not Rosatom be recognized as a terrorist organization, or why is not Rosatom on the sanctions list?
Why is not Russia recognized as a terrorist state? Why is Wagner even not recognized as a terrorist organization? I mean, there's been extreme hesitancy to close out our relationship with Russia. Okay, I mean, really, what they'll tell you over and over again, I think, the people that make these decisions, the administration, I mean, others in the West that could do similar things, Berlin or Paris, will say, legally speaking, these actions are not terrorism, which I mean is prima facie kind of ridiculous. I mean, like when you're destroying civilian, I mean, residential buildings, when you're just willy-nilly killing people, I mean, this is terrorism. This is like textbook terrorism. But what they'll tell you is it's not terrorism, it's war crimes. And the United States has, to its credit, labeled these crimes against humanity, right? So I mean, that's big. I mean, it's not terrorism. And I mean, it's also kind of like the consequences of that are far down the road. Right?
Well, but you can sanction also the war criminals. Rosatom can be sanctioned as a organization which helps Russia to organize war crime, like nuclear blackmailing.
Well, you could, but the problem is that the war criminals kind of angle opens up another avenue, a much more comfortable avenue of prosecution after all the evil's been done. You see, this is kind of essentially one of these cop-out failures, in my opinion, in kind of the Western mindset of like, okay, we'll take legal avenues. We'll put an arrest warrant out for Putin. We'll put an arrest warrant out for the Rosatom guys, maybe, and then if they ever travel to the West, we'll arrest them and we'll try them in the Hague. Like, I mean,
well, nobody tried to arrest the leaders of Iran, for example, or of other regimes. I still don't see why Rosatom is not on the sanctions list.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that it's a cop-out. It lets us pretend we're doing something. It makes it look like we're doing something without actually having to do something. And the reason we don't do something, I mean, you're very focused on Rosatom, but I think this goes to Wagner, to Russia, to all these kind of organizations, is because we want to keep the door open to normalization of relations with Russia, to some type of, I mean, to sanction Rosatom. First of all, there's a huge number of nuclear power plants in Central and Eastern Europe that rely on Rosatom's expertise, given the kind of Soviet legacy. I mean, Russia's kind of this nuclear know-how hub, very sadly, in a way that we haven't been able to replace, and that a lot of Central and Eastern European countries haven't invested in replacing. And then there's countries like Hungary that just straight up, hey, let's make some new power plants, come on in, Rosatom. And of course, Hungary gets a veto over anything nuclear, so there's your kind of direct answer on Rosatom within the EU. But when it comes down to it, using these terrorist labels basically cuts the country out of the international framework permanently. North Korea, Iran. I mean, you said Iran. When you push this onto these countries, basically we're saying we're done with you. We're cutting off diplomatic relations. Your sovereign assets are up for, private suits can go against your sovereign assets for damages and that sort of thing. We're putting a whole new set of sanctions automatically comes into play. No banking, no nothing. Which of course is the reason the Ukrainians want it, because it would absolutely crush Russia to be designated a state sponsor of terror, and rightfully so, and take them out of the international system. To hit Rosatom very seriously would just remove Rosatom, which of course would have follow-on consequences for all these countries that use Rosatom technology. Maybe that'd be a fine thing. Maybe that'd be okay, but we have to, that's being considered when these decisions are being made. To hit Wagner, call them a state sponsor of terror, which, the commission has bills in Congress to do this. would lead to follow-on sanctions on sort of African dictators and this sort of thing, right? So there's all these follow-ons as you actually took this seriously. That doesn't mean you shouldn't. In fact, we should. But these are the reasons we don't. So I'm explaining, not justifying. We get caught in this world of half measures, in not taking this seriously enough, in not actually cutting these guys out like we should, because we're still, can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we support Ukraine while also leaving the door open for Russia? And the answer is no.
Is that the view which is being shared by both the US and European elites from your perspective?
Yes. Yes. I mean, but who should we talk about when we talk about elites? I mean, people talk about
like Berlin, France.
Berlin, Paris, and Washington. But obviously, European elites also include Prague, Helsinki, Warsaw.
We clearly know what is the view of Tallinn, Riga, Vilnius, Warsaw, and others. Like they clearly hawks in this.
But we need to take those views extremely seriously, because they're decision makers. They were right the entire time, while Western Europe was wrong. I mean, we should actually be taking them much more seriously than we're taking Berlin and Paris at this point. I mean, Berlin and Paris have been wrong for decades. I mean, Berlin in particular pursued a policy of total dependence on Russia, despite everyone, not just the United States, but everyone being like, what are you doing? And the insistence with Nord Stream 2 that it's only a commercial deal, and all this other corruption, this continued corruption. A former German chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, works for Putin to this day. So we need to get very serious about who we're listening to and who we're taking seriously. And I think now is the time to take the Central and Eastern Europeans much, much, much more seriously. I mean, we should have been taking them seriously, but much more seriously than we've taken them in the past.
Well, to make my point clear, I focused on Berlin, Paris, and Washington because there are still concerns about the consistency of their policy, not because they are elites and the others are not.
Yeah.
But if we talk about what will be like after this war, many says it's too early to say what will be after this war, but still we need this policy. How do you see the integration of Ukraine into the Western security and political mechanism? Is Ukraine soon a NATO member?
Well, first of all, we need complete Ukrainian victory. And recently in Congress, both chambers introduced the Ukraine Victory Resolution, basically laying this out as the U.S. policy goal, meaning three points. Victory means the restoration of 1991 borders, so internationally recognized 1991 borders, integration into NATO and other Euro-Atlantic institutions, and then sort of justice and reconstruction. So that's what needs to happen. I mean, if there is not total Ukrainian victory, then we're basically just waiting for Russia to attack again. And the other thing is it'll really hurt Ukraine, it'll really hurt all of us, because it'll make it impossible for the private sector to really truly invest in Ukraine, because its borders aren't secure, and we'll all know the next Russian invasion is just right around the corner, because this is what they do. This has been Russia for at least since 2007, but I mean, I think you could even go all the way back to 1993. And I mean, depending on how far you want to go back, you go all the way back to the Mongols. But I mean, this is what we're looking at with Russia right now. So we need to ensure that Ukraine is completely victorious. When Ukraine is completely victorious, yeah, absolutely. We said Ukraine would be a member of NATO in 2008 at the Bucharest summit. We have committed, not just the United States, but all NATO states have committed to Ukraine joining NATO. So it's about time we fulfill our commitments. I mean, it blows me away. We literally, it's like word for word, we say Ukraine will be a member of NATO.
Yeah, but after that, there came this position of Angela Merkel, German federal chancellor, and all the talk that, Ukraine is not fit, Ukraine is too corrupt, Ukraine is too poor, and we don't want you to make Russia angry. Are all these talks, like this corruption accusation and don't angry Moscow, etc., will be vivid again after the victory of Ukraine, which we all strive to?
I'm sure some people will bring it up, okay? But the fact is we all, Berlin, Paris, Washington, again, when I say we in this particular scenario, need to have a lot of humility toward Ukraine, because we got this so devastatingly wrong. We almost, our incredibly wrong perspective toward Ukraine almost led to the end. I mean, it almost led to the end of NATO, I mean, it almost led to an invasion of the EU by Russia. I mean, come on, so we need to be, Ukraine basically prevented a world war. It turned out to be exactly almost the opposite of what everyone accused it of being. I mean, it simply cannot be. I mean, it's just factually cannot be as corrupt as people claim it to be, because otherwise it wouldn't have been able to defend itself like this. I mean, so obviously we were eating we were drinking the Russian Kool-Aid, so to speak. Russia turned out to be exactly as corrupt, even more corrupt than we thought it was, given that it can't seem to fight, despite the fact that it was supposed to have this incredible military force, but all of its fuel has been sold, all of its rations have been sold on the black market, all that kind of stuff, So I think that people, there will be those that, particularly in France, I think, because France, for geopolitical reasons, is afraid of Ukraine joining the EU because of Ukraine's agricultural and natural resource power. And I think that, particularly in the West, the Berlin sort of Paris axis will have issues with EU accession, because if you have kind of a Warsaw-Kiev axis, then suddenly you've got a different power center in the EU, and maybe that would be good for the EU, to be honest. But it will, cause apprehension in Paris and Berlin. But it's something basically they're going to have to get over, because there aren't just kind of geopolitical concerns here. There are also moral concerns. There are also kind of larger national security concerns of, isn't this really good to have this large EU bloc that can be very powerful vis-a-vis China? Isn't that what the EU strategy has been for a long time, to make itself very powerful against China? Okay, well, if that's the case, then Ukraine absolutely needs to be part of the EU. And then in NATO, I mean, it's a no-brainer. I mean, NATO is just an absolute no-brainer to bring Ukraine into the EU. To bring Ukraine into NATO. The Ukraine will have essentially the second most powerful military in NATO when it's in NATO. I mean, why wouldn't we want Ukraine? I mean, with Ukraine, we're all like way safer. Ukraine has more weapons than any European state, basically. So
more experience,
knows how to use them and will use them. More commitment to, and I mean, you can't underestimate this. More commitment to actually using arms to defend their freedom. I mean, there was this poll, gosh, I think it was Gallup, but it was like 19% of Germans would fight if their country was invaded. I mean, like, what do you do with that? I mean,
why do you need this country?
Well, there are other reasons. I mean, I'm not here to Germany bash or anything. I just mean, no, we have to really consider what Ukraine brings to the table. And it's just amazing levels of commitment, fighting spirit, just an absolutely vital ally. And I mean, if Ukraine's in NATO, and then we have this whole border with NATO, man, we can sanction Russia, put them in the dustbin of history, and then focus on other things, But if Ukraine doesn't win, then there'll have to be a massive arms buildup in Europe again, while we go into this kind of Cold War style scenario again with Russia. So it's important that we decisively defeat Russia.
Well, the last question, although I would be happy to ask you a lot of them more, what are your forecasts for the next months?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. Look, I mean, it's possible Ukraine wins this year, and what that would entail is a successful counteroffensive that's able to cut off Crimea, and then essentially you'd have to besiege Crimea, and that's going to be a hard decision to make, of course. People often talk about how, like, okay, yeah, like a amphibious assault, that's going to be very hard. Well, you wouldn't even need to do an amphibious assault. You don't need to. You can cut off the water supply. I mean, you can really make it hard. Life on Crimea, very, very, very hard. It's a hard decision for Ukrainians to make, of course, because Ukrainians live on Crimea too. I mean, that's why they want to get Crimea back. It's theirs. It's their territory. But I think it's one of those things that you just have to do. It's tough because it's Russian occupied. Obviously, when Kherson was occupied by Russia, you needed to shoot into Kherson. Now, when I was in Kherson, I mean, the extremely amazing precision weapons that we provided Ukraine, these HIMARS, you could see the way that they were able to target these HIMARS, so they only hit collaborators, so they only hit Russian military forces. They would point out to me, they'd say, here's a building, building up there, and here's the room, literally the room in the building that the Russian collaborator lived in, and they were able to just kill the collaborator and nobody else. Just the one room was blown out and the rest of the building was still standing. It was like extraordinary precision. It's going to be a lot harder in Crimea to pull that kind of thing off. I think there's going to be kind of more collateral damage at the end of the day, but it's what you need to do because you need to get the peninsula back. Once Ukraine has liberated Crimea, basically they win. I mean, then Russia's hanging on to a few outposts in the eastern Donbass. I mean, you've basically undermined the Putin regime's entire legitimacy, whole point of fighting this war, essentially. And I think we can see the end of the war on the horizon. Not to mention that the liberation of Crimea will lead to an enormous burst of momentum. See, here's the thing that I think is tough. It's really tough about this war. Because when the Ukrainians start winning, they win. Nothing succeeds like success. When the West was really gung-ho on Ukraine, every time it's become really gung-ho on Ukraine, it's when they see the heroism and victories from Ukraine. It's a very sad thing about Western psychology in the way that we've been overloaded with tragedy on TV and stuff like that. That when we see the tragedies, we say, "Oh, that's terrible," and then we don't do anything. But what seemed just so extraordinary about Ukraine was, particularly in the initial invasion, when you saw these Ukrainians fighting back. It was like, oh my God, they're fighting back. This is amazing. They were prying off the tops of tanks with knives and throwing grenades in and just walking out and just blowing them up with the javelins. I mean, it was an amazing sight. When the Kharkiv-Kherson offensive happened, it was just amazing. It was like, all right, like send them in. And when this counteroffensive succeeds, there will be another burst of momentum where it'll be like, oh my God, they can do this. They can win the war. Send them everything, you know? So it's really important that this counteroffensive be successful. I think there's every indication it will be successful. The only worry I have is that the West might, like the Ukrainian worry in a sense, the West might insist that it not be successful. The West might not provide the right weapons, or the West might not allow for the right tactics to be used with their weapons. And if any of that happens, we will regret it forever. And it'll be a black stain, another black stain on the reputation of the NATO. I mean, well, NATO's not involved in this, but I guess the NATO allies, as well as in particular, kind of the donors, the United States, Germany, France, because I know that others are saying, go get them, So we really need to be doing as much as possible to make this counteroffensive successful.
Thank you, Paul. It was amazing. I hope you enjoyed this interview too. You have watched the interview with Paul Massaro, Senior Policy Advisor at US Helsinki Commission. Follow us, share us, like us, and don't forget to donate for the European Resilience Initiative Center and for our project. See you soon.